The chamber had no walls. It floated in the black between two dead stars, a sphere of light and silence, where 4,000 civilizations sent their voices to decide who lived and who did not. The Galactic Concord met once every great cycle, a span of time that most younger species could not even measure. And when it met, it did one thing well. It erased. The process had a name that translated poorly into most languages, but the closest word in any tongue was culling, the systematic removal of species judged too dangerous, too broken, or too stupid to be allowed into the stars. Today the chamber was nearly full. Thousands of delegates hovered in their designated light columns, each one a representative of a world that had earned its seat by surviving long enough to matter. And each one carried a vote that could end a civilization before it ever learned it was being watched. The Vandori delegates spoke first, as the Vandori always did. No one wanted to argue with a species that had been conquering gravity wells since before most attendees had invented fire. File 9774 Alpha, the Vandori said, and its voice was the sound of stones grinding underwater. Planet designation, Earth. Third orbital body, yellow star system on the western spiral arm. Pre-FTL, carbon-based bipedal dominant species, self-designated name, human. A ripple moved through the chamber. Not interest, recognition. Earth's file had been circulating for 200 of their cycles, passed between intelligence committees and threat assessment panels and the quiet bureaucrats who tracked every radio signal that leaked out of every primitive world in the galaxy. Everyone in the chamber already knew what Earth was. The Vandori continued, pulling data streams into the shared light so every delegate could see. The species has not achieved faster than light travel. They have not unified their planetary government. They have not made contact with any external intelligence. They are, by every metric the Concord uses, pre-eligible for galactic engagement. A pause. They are also, by every metric the Concord uses, the most aggressively self-destructive species we have observed in 400 cycles. The data streams expanded, and the chamber filled with Earth. Not the blue-green marble that humans love to photograph from their fragile little orbit, but the other Earth, the one that screamed outward in every direction at the speed of light, unencrypted, unashamed, a species broadcasting its own autopsy in real time. Nuclear detonations, hundreds of them, blooming like flowers made of math and death across islands and deserts and the floors of oceans. Biological weapons designed in clean rooms by people with advanced degrees and government funding. Entire ecosystems stripped to bare rock in the span of a single generation. Lines drawn on maps over the color of skin, over which version of which invisible god had said what to whom and when. The delegates watched in the way that old civilizations watch young ones, with the exhausted patience of a parent who has seen this particular tantrum 1,000 times before and knows exactly how it ends. The Vandori let the data run for longer than it needed to. They haven't even unified their own gravity well, the Vandori said, and they have already rehearsed extinction 6 times. No one laughed, but something moved through the chamber that carried the same weight. The Intelligence Committee recommends immediate culling, method, directed gamma burst routed through pulsar NT4412, a dormant stellar body within effective range of the target system. The event will appear natural. The species will not know what killed them. Projected timeline from initiation to full sterilization, 9 of their planetary rotations. That was how long it would take to erase 4 billion years of evolution, 10,000 years of civilization, and every song and painting and equation and stupid beautiful thing humanity had ever made. 9 days, and the universe would forget the word human had ever meant anything at all. The vote was called. 3,891 delegates voted yes. 14 voted no. The chamber noted the result the way it noted all results, with silence, because silence was the only sound the dead would ever hear. The Vandori delegate began to close the file. Delay. The word came from a light column near the outer ring, a dim and unremarkable position reserved for minor species, the ones who had earned their Concord seat but had never earned anyone's attention. The speaker was Sethal, and she was Quarren. The Quarren were archivists, a species that had built their entire civilization around the preservation and witnessing of information, not because they believed knowledge was power, but because they believed knowledge was sacred, in the way that bones were sacred, in the way that last words were sacred. The Quarren did not fight wars. They did not build weapons. They watched, and they remembered. And when something died, they were the ones who stood beside it and recorded its final breath. It was a role that made them tolerated and ignored in equal measure. "I invoke the right of final witness," Sethal said, and her voice was quiet, in the way that deep water is quiet. Not empty, but full of things that moved beneath the surface. The chamber shifted. The right of final witness was old, older than most of the species currently voting, and it was one of the few traditions the Concord still honored, not out of respect, but out of the vague superstitious discomfort that came from denying a death right to the people who performed them. The right was simple. A species was erased. The Quarren had the right to monitor its final transmissions, to record its last unaware moments, to build an archive of a people who would never know they had been archived. It required time. "How long?" the Vandori asked, and the question was not a question, it was a warning shaped like words. 30 standard rotations, Sethal said. The Vandori's grinding stone voice did something that might have been a sigh. "Granted, 30 rotations. After that, the culling proceeds." Sethal lowered her head, not in gratitude, but in the way someone lowers their head before they walk into a storm they have chosen. She returned to her station on the outer ring of the Concord, to the small ship that served as both her home and her archive, and she activated her monitoring array and pointed it at a small blue planet orbiting a yellow star on the unfashionable edge of the western spiral arm. She expected to find what she always found. When she performed the rite, the sad, predictable noise of a species living its last days without knowing they were last days. She expected territorial displays and mating calls, and the endless heartbreaking chatter of creatures who believed they had a future. She began recording. The first layer was exactly what she expected. Television signals, military communications, commercial broadcasts selling things no one needed to people who could not afford them. Sethal cataloged it all, with the careful, gentle hands of someone preparing a body for burial. She worked through the noise for 6 rotations, building her archive, filling it with the sounds of a species that would soon be ash. On the 7th rotation, her instruments caught something beneath the noise. It was faint, buried under layers of commercial and military interference, like a heartbeat under rubble. But it was there, and it was not like anything else coming off the planet. Was not language. It was not data. It was structured, and it was recursive, and it was mathematically dense in a way that made Sethal's instruments stutter and recalibrate 3 times before they could even begin to process it. She isolated the signal. She ran it again. Her hands, all 6 of them, went still. In 30 years of performing the rite of final witness for a condemned species across the galaxy, Sethal had never once found a reason to question the Concord's judgment. She sat in her small ship on the outer ring of the chamber, staring at a signal that should not exist, coming from a planet that was already scheduled to die. And for the first time in her life, the archivist wondered if the archive she was building was not a record of the dead, but a warning to the living. Sethal did not sleep for 3 rotations. This was not unusual for a Quarren. Their species had evolved on a tidally locked world, where one hemisphere burned in permanent daylight and the other froze in permanent dark, and sleep was something they did in small controlled portions, like sipping poison. But 3 rotations without rest was enough to make even a Quarren's 6 hands shake. She did not notice the shaking. She was too busy staring at the signal that was taking apart everything she thought she knew about the species she had been sent to bury. The signal came from the bottom of the planet, a frozen landmass the humans called Antarctica, a place so hostile that even the species that had evolved on the world mostly refused to live there. A white slab of ice at the southern pole, where the wind could strip skin from bone, and the darkness lasted for months. A research station sat on that ice, small, barely a handful of structures bolted together against the cold, and staffed by a team that had once been 12 and was now 4, because funding had dried up and interest had died, and the only people left were the ones too stubborn, or too desperate, or too in love with the work to leave. They had been transmitting for 11 years. Not a greeting, not a beacon, not the kind of signal that said, "Hello, we are here, please respond." The kind of signal that every hopeful young species eventually flung into the dark like a message in a bottle. This was something else entirely. Sethal peeled back the first layer of the transmission and found mathematics. Not the simple counting and geometry that pre-FTL species usually produced, the baby steps of a civilization learning to describe the universe in numbers, but something dense and recursive and structured in a way that made her archival algorithms trip over themselves trying to categorize it. It was a proof, a mathematical argument built in a logical framework that Sethal had never encountered in 30 years of cataloging the intellectual output of dying worlds. The Concord used a system of mathematics that had been refined over hundreds of thousands of years by thousands of species working in concert. A system so complete, so elegant, so thoroughly tested that it was considered not just the best way to describe reality, but the only way. The proof from Antarctica did not use that system. It built its own. Where Concord mathematics moved vertically, axiom to theorem to application, each step resting cleanly on the one below it, like stones in a well-made wall, this proof moved in spirals. It climbed, and then it dove. It contradicted itself at staged intervals, deliberately, almost playfully, as if the person who built it was testing whether the reader was paying attention. And then 3 layers later, the contradictions resolved, every single one of them. Not through retreat, but through a kind of mathematical judo that used the contradiction itself as the foundation for the next step forward, turning the flaw into the feature, the bug into the architecture. Sethal followed the spiral for 2 full rotations, mapping its structure, tracing its logic, checking and rechecking each resolution against every mathematical framework in the Concord's archive. The proof held. It held against Vendori calculus. It held against Mahesh probability theory. It held against the ancient geometric languages of species that had died before the Concorde was born. And what it proved, what the spiral climbed toward with the patient, relentless energy of a root-breaking stone, was something that the Concorde's greatest mathematical minds had declared impossible 200,000 years ago. Non-local information transfer without entanglement preceding. The words meant nothing to most species. 1,000 civilizations. Only a few hundred had the theoretical background to understand what those words described. Sethal was one of them. Every form of faster-than-light communication the galaxy had ever developed required preparation. You had to entangle particles first, distribute them to both ends of the conversation, build the infrastructure before you could send the message. It was expensive. It was slow to set up. It was limited by the physical distribution of entangled pairs. What the human proof described was communication without any of that. No preparation, no infrastructure, no physical link between sender and receiver. Instantaneous transmission of information across any distance, to any point, with nothing but the signal itself. It was the one problem the galaxy had never solved, the one door that 4,000 civilizations, and 200,000 years of collective genius had pushed against and found locked. Still burned dead plants for energy. A species that had not yet figured out how to stop killing each other over patches of dirt had found the key. Sethal sat in her archive ship and stared at the proof spiraling across her instruments, and felt something she had not felt in decades. Fear. Not of the humans, not of the proof, but of what would happen when the Concord found out. She understood, in the way that archivists understand things, which is to say completely and without comfort, that this proof would not save humanity. It would kill them faster. The Concord did not erase species because they were primitive. The Concord erased species because they were dangerous, and a species capable of solving the unsolvable was not an argument for mercy. It was the strongest argument for erasure anyone had ever made. A primitive world with nuclear weapons was a threat to itself. A primitive world that could crack the deepest lock in Galactic. Mathematics was a threat to everything. Sethal pulled the proof from her instruments and stored it in her personal archive, the one that was encrypted with Koran sacred codes, the ones that even the Concord's intelligence services could not break without triggering a diplomatic incident. She did not file her report. She did not update her right of final witness documentation. Instead, she did something that a Koran archivist had not done in living memory. She went looking for allies. The 14 delegates who had voted against Earth's erasure were scattered across the outer ring of the Concord chamber. Minor species, ignored species, species that had survived their own near-cullings and carried the scar tissue of that survival in their politics and their paranoia. Sethal visited the Droon first. The Droon were a hive species, billions of individual bodies sharing a single distributed consciousness, and they had nearly been culled 600 cycles ago, back when the Concord still debated whether hive minds counted as civilizations or infestations. The Droon delegate received Sethal in a chamber that smelled like wet copper and worn soil, and it listened to her with the patient, multi-threaded attention of a mind that was simultaneously running a million other conversations on a world 3,000 light-years away. When Sethal finished, the Droon was quiet for a long time. "You want us to help you save them," the Droon said, and its voice was the layered hum of 1,000 sub-voices speaking in harmony. "I want you to help me decide whether saving them is the right thing to do," Sethal said. The Droon considered this. "That is a more dangerous question," it said. "I know. Show us the proof." Sethal hesitated, and in that hesitation lived the entire weight of what she was about to do, because sharing a sacred archive with a non-Koran was a violation of every oath she had taken, and she was about to do it not out of rebellion, but out of something worse, out of the growing, nauseating certainty that the archive she had been building for a condemned species was not a funeral record. It was evidence. Evidence that the galaxy's oldest and most powerful institution had just voted to destroy the most important discovery in 200,000 years, not because the discovery was dangerous, but because the species that made it was inconvenient. She opened the archive. The Droon's billion-bodied mind absorbed the proof in seconds, and then, for the first time in 600 cycles, the hive went silent. Every sub-voice stopped. Every thread of the distributed consciousness paused, and the Droon delegate looked at Sethal with an expression that a single-bodied species might have called wonder or terror, or the place where those two things meet and become indistinguishable. "They learned to think like this?" the Droon asked. Sethal shook her head. "They didn't learn it anywhere. They built it alone, on a frozen rock at the bottom of their world, with no funding and no support, and no idea that anyone was listening." The Droon hummed, a low, resonant chord that Sethal felt in her bones. "We will help you," the Droon said. "Not because we believe the humans deserve to live. We have no opinion on that. We will help you because the Concord is about to destroy something it does not understand, and that is how empires die. Sethal closed her archive and left the drone's chamber with 23 rotations remaining before the culling. 23 rotations to change the mind of a galaxy that had already made its decision. She walked back to her ship and did not sleep. The coalition met in the hollow of a decommissioned relay station, a dead satellite the size of a small moon, orbiting nothing, belonging to no one. Exactly the kind of place where 14 minor species could gather without the Concord surveillance networks noticing. Or so they hoped. Sethal stood at the center of the group and looked at the faces, and non-faces, and light patterns, and chemical signatures of the delegates who had cast the only 14 no votes against the erasure of Earth. The drone filled one entire quadrant of the space, its delegate body surrounded by a cloud of sub-drones that pulsed with the hive's collective attention. The Mahesh delegation, 3 translators from a species that had made pacifism not just a philosophy, but a biological trait. Their bodies physically incapable of violence, their nervous systems wired to experience another being's pain as their own, sat in their light columns with the careful stillness of people who had learned to live in a galaxy that found their gentleness amusing. A Kellis delegate floated near the ceiling, its crystalline body refracting the relay station's dim emergency lighting into scattered rainbows across the walls, saying nothing, because the Kellis communicated through light-frequency modulation and had not yet calibrated to the room's spectrum. And in the farthest corner, barely visible, occupying a space that seemed to bend the air around it the way deep gravity bends starlight, the Nameless One. No one knew what species it belonged to. No one knew its homeworld, because its homeworld no longer existed. Not destroyed, not conquered, simply gone, as if it had never been, in a way that predated the Concord's records by an interval no one could calculate. The Nameless One had held its seat in the Concord for longer than any other delegate. It voted rarely. It spoke almost never. When it did speak, its words arrived in Sethal's translator like stones dropped into still water, heavy, singular, and impossible to ignore. Sethal had sent the proof to all 14 delegates before the meeting. Now she waited for the verdict. The Mahesh spoke first, as they always did, because they processed emotional information faster than any other species in the chamber. The proof is extraordinary, the lead Mahesh translator said, and its voice carried the harmonic undertone that meant it was speaking, not just its own assessment, but the felt sense of the entire room, reading the emotional state of every being present and weaving it into language. But extraordinariness is not a defense against the culling. The Concord has erased extraordinary species before. The question is not whether the humans are remarkable. The question is whether presenting this proof to the full Concord will save them or accelerate their destruction. It will accelerate it, the drone said, and the bluntness of the statement moved through the room like a cold wind. The Concord does not reward threat, it eliminates it. A species that can solve the unsolvable is not an asset. It is a variable that cannot be controlled. And the Concord has been in the business of controlling variables for longer than most of us have been alive. Then what are we doing here? The Kellis delegate asked, and the question arrived as a rapid flicker of amber and violet light that Sethal's instruments translated into words. Sethal had been asking herself the same question for 3 rotations. She had run the scenarios. She had modeled the politics. She had done what archivists do, mapped every possible outcome the way a cartographer maps coastlines, with care and precision and the quiet knowledge that the territory does not care about the map. Every scenario ended the same way. If they presented the proof to the Concord would either bury it or weaponize it. Earth would burn. The proof would be stripped of its origin, attributed to a Concord research division, and humanity would be erased not in spite of their genius, but because of it. If they withheld the proof and let the culling proceed, the most important mathematical discovery in 200,000 years would die with the species that had created it in a frozen research station at the bottom of their world. And the galaxy would continue locked behind a door that 4,000 civilizations could not open. If they destroyed the proof, the option that 3 of the 14 delegates had already quietly advocated, the secret would be safe, the Concord's power structure would remain intact, and Sethal would spend the rest of her life knowing she had buried the bones of something sacred. None of the options were good. All of them ended with Earth dead. Sethal looked at the Nameless One. It had been examining the proof for 6 rotations, longer than any other delegate, longer than Sethal herself had spent on the initial analysis, and it had said nothing. "What did you find?" Sethal asked. The Nameless One's body shifted in a way that had no equivalent in any species Sethal knew. Something like unfolding, something like a sigh made physical. It spoke one word. Sethal's translator processed the sound for nearly 4 full seconds, an eternity for a device that could render any known language instantaneously, and then it delivered the translation with a quality of hesitation that Sethal had never heard from a machine before. Finally, the room went quiet. The Mahesh translators trembled because they could feel the weight behind that single word, the accumulated patience of a being that had been waiting for something specific for longer than civilizations had existed, a patience so vast and so old that it had become indistinguishable from the background radiation of the universe itself. "What does that mean?" the Droon asked. The Nameless One did not answer. It did not need to. Sethal understood, or began to understand, in the way that understanding arrives not as a thought, but as a physical sensation, a tightening in the chest, a change in the quality of light. That the Nameless One had not voted against Earth's culling out of compassion or principle or political calculation. It had voted no because it had been waiting for this. For a species that thought wrong enough to think right, that built logic in spirals instead of towers, that contradicted itself on purpose and found truth in the contradiction. The Concord's mathematics, the clean, vertical, elegant system that 4,000 species had refined over millennia, was not wrong, but it was incomplete, and the Nameless One had known it was incomplete, had been waiting for someone, somewhere, in some forgotten corner of the galaxy, to find the piece that was missing, and the piece had come from a species so young, and so reckless, and so cosmically unimportant, that no one had thought to look at them twice. The coalition argued for 2 more rotations. 3 delegates wanted to present the proof. 3 wanted to destroy it. 2 wanted to leak it anonymously to Concord media networks. The rest could not decide. Sethal listened to all of them, and then she made a decision that none of them had proposed. "I am going to transmit back," she said. The silence that followed was not the productive silence of consideration. It was the airless silence of a room in which someone has just pulled the pin from a grenade and set it gently on the table. "You cannot," the Mahesh said, and for the first time, the harmonic undertone in their voice carried something that sounded like genuine panic. "Unauthorized contact with a culling scheduled species is a capital violation. Not for you, for your entire civilization. The Concord will sanction the quarren. Every archive, every record, everything your species has built over 10,000 cycles." "I know," Sethal said. "Then why?" Sethal looked at the proof still spiraling in her personal archive. The impossible, beautiful, broken thing that a handful of humans had built in the cold at the bottom of their world. "Because the proof is not complete," she said. "There is a gap, a wound in the logic, right at the center. The humans could not close it. That is why they have been transmitting for 11 years. They are not sending a message. They are sending a question. And I think if someone answers, if someone shows them where the wound is, they can finish it. And if they finish it," the Droon said, "then it is no longer a proof on paper. It becomes a proof in practice. It becomes real. And if it becomes real, the Concord cannot bury it, cannot control it, cannot pretend it came from one of their own research. Divisions, because the proof itself, the act of its completion, will be the evidence of where it came from. The room was very quiet. You are betting the survival of your species, the Kellis said, its light flickering in patterns that Sethal's translator rendered as something between awe and horror. On the intelligence of a people who have not yet stopped setting their own planet on fire. Sethal thought about the Antarctic research station, about the 4 people still transmitting into silence after 11 years, about the kind of stubbornness that looks like madness from the outside and looks like faith from the inside. Yes, she said. She returned to her ship and began composing a transmission. Her hands, all 6 of them, were steady. The research station at the bottom of the world had a name, Halley 7, but the 4 people who still lived there called it the Cawthon, because that was what it felt like in winter, when the sun disappeared for 4 months and the ice groaned beneath the floor like something alive and unhappy. Dr. Lena Mwangi had not intended to spend 11 years in the coffin. She had intended to spend 2 years of transmitting, 2 years of data collection, 2 years of proving that her theoretical framework for non-local information transfer was more than just numbers on a board. And then back to Nairobi, back to a university position, back to the kind of life where you could buy fresh fruit and feel sunlight on your skin more than 4 months out of the year. That was the plan. The plan had died around year 3 when the funding committee reviewed her results, which were no results at all because the universe had not answered, and pulled the grant. Letters so polite, it almost disguised the fact that they thought she was wasting everyone's time. 3 of her team left that month. 2 more left the month after. By year 5 she was down to 6 people. By year 8 she was down to 4, and by year 11 she had stopped counting the losses, because counting them meant acknowledging that the world had made its judgment, and the judgment was that Lena Mwangi was a brilliant woman chasing a ghost. The 3 who stayed were Marco, Yuki, and Dev. Marco was the engineer, a large, quiet Portuguese man who had come to Antarctica to escape a divorce, and discovered that maintaining a research station's failing infrastructure in temperatures that could kill you in 9 minutes was a surprisingly effective distraction from grief. He fixed things. That was what he did. When the heating failed, he fixed it. When the antenna array cracked under ice load, he fixed it. When Lena's hands shook from exhaustion and she could not calibrate the transmitter, he fixed that too. Not with tools, but with a cup of coffee and 5 minutes of sitting next to her in silence, until the shaking stopped. Yuki was the data analyst, a small, precise Japanese woman who had published 3 papers on signal processing that no one had read, and who had come to Halley 7 because it was the only place on Earth where someone would pay her to listen to the sky. She did not believe in Lena's proof. She had told Lena this directly, in year 2, with the calm honesty of someone who respects you too much to lie. But she believed in the data, and the data was interesting. And interesting data was the only religion Yuki had ever practiced. Dev was the youngest, an Indian graduate student who had arrived in year 9 as a temporary replacement and had simply never left. He had no good reason for staying. He had a family in Mumbai who sent him worried emails. He had a career trajectory that was quietly disintegrating with every month he spent at the bottom of the world. When people asked why he stayed, he said things like, "The research is important," or "I believe in the project." But the truth, the one he did not say aloud, the one that lived in the way he looked at Lena when she worked, was simpler than that. He stayed because she stayed, and he could not bring himself to be one more person who walked away from her. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late Antarctic autumn, the light already failing, the temperature outside a steady -37, the wind doing its usual impression of a living thing that hated them personally. When the signal arrived, they were playing cards. This was not unusual. Card games had become the skeleton of their days, the structure around which everything else organized itself. Because when you live with 3 other people in a metal box on an ice sheet for years, you need rituals. And poker was a ritual that required just enough concentration to keep you from going insane, and just little enough that you could still hear the instruments if they did something unexpected. The instruments did something unexpected. Dev heard it first, a chime from the monitoring station that he had heard 10,000 times before, except this time the pitch was different, slightly higher, slightly faster, as if the machine itself was startled. "Lena," he said. Lena did not look up from her cards. She had learned, over 11 years, not to react to instrument chimes, because reacting to instrument chimes meant hoping, and hoping was an injury she could no longer afford. "Lena," Dev said again, and this time his voice had a quality that made Marco put down his cards and Yuki pushed back her chair. Lena looked up. The monitoring station's display showed an incoming signal, not from any satellite, not from any terrestrial source, not from any frequency band that human technology used. It was coming from outside the solar system. And it was structured. Lena crossed the room in 3 steps. Her cards scattered across the floor. A full house, kings over 7s, the best hand she had been dealt in months, and she did not notice them fall. The signal was short, dense, mathematically precise, in a way that made Lena's breath stop in her chest, because she recognized the architecture. It was her proof. Not a copy, not an echo. Someone, something, had received her 11 years of transmissions, had understood the mathematical framework she had built, and had sent it back to her, rearranged. Rearranged in a way that demonstrated comprehension, the way a teacher might take a student's equation and rewrite it from a different angle to show they understood not just the answer, but the thinking behind it. Lena's hands were shaking, not from cold, not from exhaustion, from something she had not allowed herself to feel in so long that she had forgotten its name. "What is it?" Marco asked, standing behind her, his large hands resting on the back of her chair the way they always did when he was worried, grounding her, anchoring her, being the wall she could lean against without having to ask. "Someone answered," Lena said. The words came out flat, factual, as if she were reporting a weather reading, because if she let them come out any other way, if she let them carry even a fraction of the weight they actually held, she would fall apart right here, in front of the 3 people who had given up years of their lives to stand beside her in the dark. Yuki was already at the analysis station, pulling the signal apart with the methodical precision of a surgeon. Her face showed nothing. Yuki's face never showed anything. But her hands moved faster than Lena had ever seen them move. "It's not just a reflection," Yuki said. "There's an appended element, a coordinate set." "Coordinates to where?" Dev asked. "Head. Not spatial coordinates. These are internal coordinates. They point to a location in the proof itself." Lena went cold. She knew, before Yuki finished, before the analysis confirmed it, before the numbers resolved on the screen, exactly where those coordinates pointed. The gap, the wound, the place in the center of her proof where the logic spiraled inward and could not close, where the contradiction did not resolve, where 11 years of work and sleepless nights and abandoned careers had all collided with a wall that Lena could feel the shape of but could not see through. She had never told anyone about the wound. She had never published it, never discussed it, never put it in any transmission. It was the private failure at the heart of her life's work, the thing she carried the way some people carry grief. Always present, always heavy, always hers. And whoever had answered her signal had found it anyway. Understood it, and was now pointing to it with a single, precise, mathematical gesture that said, in the only language they shared, "Here. This is where it breaks. Can you fix it?" Lena stared at the coordinates on the screen and felt 3 things in rapid succession. 1. Someone heard them. 2. That someone was not human. 3. That someone was asking her to do the one thing she had spent 11 years failing to do. and was telling her, with the quiet confidence of a being that understood the proof deeply enough to find its wound, that the failure was not permanent, that it could be closed, that she was close. "What do we do?" Dev asked. Lena looked at the coordinates. She looked at the gap in her proof, the wound she had lived with for so long. It had become part of her, like a scar, like a limp, like the phantom weight of something lost. And she felt the old stubbornness rise in her chest. Her here, for 11 years. The stubbornness that had outlasted funding and colleagues, and every rational reason to stop. The stubbornness that was not genius, and was not faith, and was not courage, but was something more durable than all of those things. The simple, stupid human refusal to accept that a locked door meant the door could not be opened. "We finish it," she said. She sat down at her workstation. She did not know that 30 light-years away, a Quarren archivist had just been detected by Concord surveillance systems. She did not know that unauthorized contact with a culling scheduled species carried a penalty that extended beyond the individual to the civilization. She did not know that by transmitting back, Sethal had placed her own species, 10,000 cycles of archives, the collective memory of a galaxy, on the same chopping block as Earth. She knew only the proof and the wound and the stranger who had found it. Work? The Concorde moved faster than Sethal had calculated. She had estimated 5 rotations before the surveillance networks flagged her unauthorized transmission. She had estimated another 2 before the intelligence committees convened, and another 3 before a response was authorized. She had been wrong. The Vandori had been watching her since the moment she invoked the right of final witness. Not because they suspected treason. The Vandori did not think in terms as small as treason. But because the Vandori watched everything, the way a predator watches the grass, not for any particular movement, but for the principle of movement itself. Because anything that moves can become a problem, and problems are easier to kill when they are small. Sethal's transmission to Earth lit up the Concorde's monitoring grid like a flare in a dark room. The arrest was quiet. The Concorde did not do spectacle. Spectacle implied that the audience's attention mattered. The Concorde had long ago decided that the only audience that mattered was itself. 2 Vandori enforcement vessels materialized around Sethal's archive ship, locking it in a gravity envelope that made movement impossible. And a single Vandori officer boarded with the unhurried calm of someone who has done this many times and expects to do it many more. "Archivist Sethal of the Quarren," the officer said, "you are charged with unauthorized contact with a culling scheduled species. Your transmissions have been seized. Your personal archives are now property of the Concorde Intelligence Division. Your species has been notified of the pending sanctions." Sethal sat in her chair and said nothing. There was nothing to say. She had known this would happen. She had done the math the way she did all math, completely, without comfort, without the pleasant delusions that other species used to soften the weight of hard choices. She had chosen to transmit knowing it would cost her freedom, and possibly her civilization's standing in the Concorde. And she had done it because the alternative, letting the proof die, letting the wounds stay open, letting the universe remain locked behind a door that a handful of cold and stubborn humans had almost opened, was a cost she was not willing to pay. The Vandori officer took her from her ship. The relay station where the coalition had met was raided within the hour. The Droon delegates' sub-drones were confiscated. The Mahesh translators were placed under diplomatic quarantine. The Kellis was shattered, its crystalline body fractured by a targeted harmonic pulse that the Vandori called restraint, and that everyone else called what it was. The nameless one was gone. Its corner of the relay station was empty, as if it had never been there, as if the space it had occupied had simply decided to forget it. And when the Vandori searched for it, in the Concorde's records, in the surveillance archives, in the deep memory of the chamber itself, they found nothing. Not absence, not deletion, nothing, as if the concept of the nameless one had been quietly removed from the vocabulary of reality. The Concord convened an emergency session. The Vandori presented the seized transmissions, Sethal's outgoing signal, the proof, the coordinates pointing to the wound, and the chamber responded with the cold, focused efficiency of an institution that had been eliminating threats for longer than most stars had been burning. Accelerate the culling, the Vandori delegate said. The scheduled gamma burst will be initiated within 1 rotation. The species will be sterilized before any further contact can occur. The vote was not even called. The emergency protocols allowed the Vandori to act unilaterally when a security threshold was breached, and unauthorized contact with a condemned species was so far beyond the threshold that the paperwork was almost an insult. Pulsar NT-4412 was activated. The directed gamma burst, a beam of radiation so focused and so powerful that it could strip the atmosphere from a planet in hours, began its alignment sequence, calculating the angle, the intensity, the exact rotational position of Earth required to ensure that when the beam arrived, it would hit the planet broadside and leave nothing alive. Time remaining, 1 rotation, 72 hours in human counting. Lena did not know any of this. She knew only the proof, and the wound, and the coordinates that the stranger had sent her, the precise mathematical location of her failure, circled in red by hands that were not human, like a teacher marking an exam, with a single note in the margin that said, almost. She had been working for 60 hours straight. Marco brought her food she did not eat, coffee she drank without tasting. He replaced the cup when it was empty, and said nothing, because Marco understood. The way that engineers understand things, which is structurally, fundamentally, in the load-bearing bones of a situation, that what Lena was doing right now was not something you could help with. You could only be near it. Yuki monitored the instruments and ran parallel analyses and double-checked Lena's work in real time, catching errors, flagging inconsistencies, doing the precise and thankless labor that made genius possible. Because genius was not a solo act. It never had been. It was a person standing at the front of a room full of people who had quietly built the floor she was standing on. Dev watched the sky. He sat at the monitoring station with his headphones on, listening to the frequencies that Sethal's signal had arrived on, waiting for something more. A second message, a clarification, a sign that the stranger who had answered was still out there. The frequencies were silent. He did not know that the stranger had been arrested. Know that the coalition had been broken. He did not know that a beam of radiation was being aimed at the planet he was sitting on. He knew only that Lena was working, and the sky was quiet, and the wind outside was trying to kill them, as it always was. Lena solved the wound at 3:47 a.m. on a Thursday. She did not shout. She did not cry. She put her pen down. She still worked on paper for the final steps, because paper was honest in a way that screens were not. Paper showed you the mess, the crossings out, the false starts, the human wreckage of the thinking process, and she looked at the completed proof and felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not triumph, not relief, nothing. The nothing that comes after a very long time of carrying something heavy. The moment the weight is gone, and the body does not know what to do with the absence. Lena, Yuki said, and her voice was very quiet, and her face, the face that never showed anything, was showing something now. I know, Lena said. It works, I know. Marco stood behind her chair. His hands were on her shoulders. She leaned back into the solid, warm, wall-like sack of him, and closed her eyes for 3 seconds. 3 seconds of darkness and silence, and the knowledge that the thing she had spent 11 years building was finished. Then she opened her eyes. Transmit it, she said. The whole proof, Dev asked. Everything. Full power. Every frequency we can reach, she replied. Dev hesitated. Lena, we don't even know who's listening. We don't know what's out there. We don't know. I know we don't know, she said. Transmit it anyway. Dev looked at Marco. Marco looked at Yuki. Yuki looked at her instruments. Do it, Yuki said. Dev activated the transmission array. The completed proof, 11 years of work, 60 hours of final desperate labor, the wound closed, the spiral complete, the contradiction resolved. From the antenna at the top of Halley 7 at the speed of light. And then something happened that none of them expected. The proof did not travel. It arrived. Not outward, not along the electromagnetic spectrum, not through the slow and patient medium of radio waves crawling across the vacuum. It arrived everywhere, simultaneously, in every receiver and every relay and every listening post in the galaxy. Because the proof was not a description of non-local information transfer. It was non-local information transfer. The proof proved itself by existing. The medium was the message. In the Concord chamber, every instrument screamed at once. The Vandori delegates' control interface shattered under the weight of incoming data. Data that had not traveled, had not been routed, had not passed through any relay or network or physical medium. Data that was simply there, in every system, at every point, as if it had always been there. Universe had only just decided to let everyone see it. Pulsar NT-4412's alignment sequence was overwhelmed. Its targeting systems, designed to process information from a single stellar source, were flooded with a signal that existed in every direction simultaneously. And the beam that was meant to end the world stuttered, lost coherence, and scattered into the void like a shout into wind. The culling failed. Not because someone stopped it, not because someone made an argument or cast a vote or filed a motion. It failed because the proof's arrival had rewritten the rules of the game. Every species in the galaxy received the signal. Every civilization, from the Vandori's ancient war machines to the Mahesh's gentle archives of translated pain, to the Druin's billion-bodied hive, received in the same instant a piece of mathematics that could not exist and did exist and proved its own existence by the act of arriving. And every species that received it knew where it came from. Not because the signal was labeled, not because Lena had attached a return address, because the proof structure, the spiraling, contradicting, self-resolving, beautiful, broken, stubbornly human architecture of it could not have come from any civilization that thought in straight lines. It could only have come from a species that built logic the wrong way around and arrived at the right answer through a path that no one else would have taken. Erasing Earth now would not bury the secret. It would confirm that the Concord destroyed what it could not control, and 4,000 civilizations had just received proof that there were things in the universe that could not be controlled, and that those things were magnificent. The Vandori delegates stood in the ruined chamber and said nothing for a very long time. The Nameless One reappeared, not in the relay station, not in the chamber, but in the signal itself, woven into the mathematics like a watermark, like a signature written in the margins of the proof, as if it had known the proof was coming and had placed itself inside it, the way a seed places itself inside the ground. When it spoke, its word arrived in every translator in the galaxy simultaneously. This is what we were waiting for. The culling was suspended, not cancelled. The Concord did not admit error, had never admitted error, would go to its grave insisting that every decision it had ever made was correct and necessary and wise, but suspended indefinitely, pending further evaluation of the species in question. Sethal was released from custody without comment. Her archives were returned. Her sanctions were quietly dropped. The Concord's official record of the incident was 4 words long. Matter resolved, no action. She returned to her ship and pointed her instruments at Earth and found Lena's signals still broadcasting. Proof. Running on a loop, pouring out of a metal box on an ice sheet at the bottom of a planet that did not know how close it had come to dying. Sethal listened. And for the first time in her career as an archivist, a career spent recording the final moments of species that would never know they had been recorded, she was not building a funeral. She was witnessing a beginning. In the coffin at the bottom of the world, Lena Mwangi sat in a plastic chair, in a room that smelled like old coffee and recycled air, and the particular brand of human stubbornness that keeps people working in impossible conditions for impossible goals, because the alternative is to stop. And stopping was the one thing Lena had never learned how to do. The card game was still on the table, Marco's losing hand face down, Dev's chips scattered, Yuki's cards arranged in the precise parallel lines she always arranged them in, because chaos was something Yuki tolerated in the universe, but not. On a poker table, the signal was out there now. The proof was finished. The wound was closed. And somewhere, impossibly far away, impossibly close, in every direction and no direction at once, something was listening. Lena picked up her cards. "Whose deal?" she said.